can dance. Every dance with the guy who gives you the eye, let him hold you tight.
Hi, I'm Ed, and this is one of the jukeboxes in my collection. This is a 1960 Rockola Tempo 2. It was the first stereophonic jukebox that was made by Rockola in 1960. This jukebox was a project I didn't want to get involved in. I wasn't interested in looking for this model specifically. A fellow I used to work with years ago in New York City called me up and told me his daughter had gotten this jukebox from a friend who moved to Virginia and she couldn't take it and it didn't work. So it sat in her basement and it was visibly seen, it just wasn't on, it didn't work. So he called me up and he asked me if I was interested and he sent me a picture on email and I said, nah, not really. So a couple of weeks went by, 3-4 weeks, he called me back and he said, Ed, he said, please, he says, make me an offer, get rid of this thing. So I looked at the machine again and I went, well, all right, I said, I'll give you $250 for it. That's all I want to pay because I really don't want it. He said, take it. I was hoping he'd say, forget it. So here we are. I got this machine in actually August of 2010, and it was completed in early March of 2013. So it took about 2.5 years. And when I got the machine, nothing worked. We had to go through the whole thing, including the mechanism, the amplifier being rebuilt was complex, and we ended up with the cabinet looking as good as you see it. We didn't really do much to the cabinet. All the bright work, all the chrome was in good shape. But interesting about jukeboxes, they are really precisely tuned to the age, which means the way they look, the way they play, the technology they used, and how they make you feel really is all part of that experience. And this machine in 1960, if you look at it, it's a cross between Robbie the Robot and a 1960 Chevrolet, which had these fins in the back, by the way. And of course, they were using the big windshields at the time. They called them panoramic windshields. But here you can see the whole machine working. There's nothing hidden. Everything is right in front of you. And it has outstanding fidelity. So it was an amusement device that really sounded great. And it was one of the best sounding jukeboxes of the era. And again, it's the 1960 Rockola, the first stereo jukebox that the company made. And it has 25-watt stereophonic amplifier and just excellent sound. So another part of the restoration process, but turned out successful. I'm very proud of it. And when I acquired it, it hadn't worked in 51 years. It was completely dead. And it took us 2.5 years to restore it. And then when we tried to get sound out of it from the amplifier, we couldn't get any sound from it. And we went back and we checked everything and we did everything right. So I contacted an old operator in Georgia that had worked on these 53 years earlier to see if he'd remember anything about this model. And when I told him that I couldn't get any sound, he said to me, he said, well, he says, as I recall, this is 53 years behind. In 1960, Rockola made a change to the amp in mid-production and notified the dealers sending a bulletin of the change, advising them of the change. I said, well, 1960, I was 13 years old, so I didn't get that bulletin or memo. I said, do you remember, again, 53 years later, do you remember what the change was? And he said, well, as I recall, it was a change to one of the output tubes, which meant he had to go into the amplifier and change the circuitry. Then he had to change the seat where the tube pins sit, so it all works. And then we reinstalled it, and the machine came to life. Nobody on the planet at that time would have known that except this guy. So that's what saved this project from failure, because after all that, we couldn't get the sound, and this guy remembered what it was, and we made that change because we had no place else to go, and it made the machine come alive. And that was an interesting story. This jukebox they made two models in 1960. They made a 50 record magazine. A magazine is where the records are stored. So you have two sides of 100 selections. It had 3 buttons up here instead of 5, A, B, C. And they made a higher capacity machine, this one, the Tempo 2, that held 100 records or 200 selections. And it was the first jukebox that, as I said earlier, Rockola had made that was stereo. And the way they had stereo in here is that you attach speakers to the sides, and the amplifier was designed to handle the stereo separation, and it basically balanced the output from the cabinet and the side speakers, so you get what's called a wall of sound. It's beautiful fidelity, and it was really interesting that this guy knew that and told me that's how you maximize the sound of this model, is to create that environment. So you've got this cabinet playing, and you've got these side speakers playing stereo, but the balance of it between the output is perfect. And the machine is very, very sensitive. This jukebox was also used in a television show in the UK that ran for about 7-8 years, that rated new records coming out, and a panel of 6 people, usually actors or actresses, and a studio audience. Then they would play these hits of the time and determine if they were going to be a hit or a miss. And they voted on it. And the music they played was this jukebox, this model sitting on stage, and they pressed the selection, and the machine played for about 2 minutes or so. And it determined a hit or a miss. So this model became very, very noticeable in Europe, and it turns out it's the most collectible model in Europe. And very rare to see one restored like this. But they were considered state-of-the-art at the time, and the fidelity on this is so good that when I have musicians come here, professionals, and listen to this jukebox, they understand that this is really the analog sound, top of the line analog sound that professional musicians are always striving for, but they could never reach. And this machine has that sound. It uses 2 Jensen 12-inch woofers, bass speakers, and then it uses something that handles the mid-range and high notes. It uses what's called a flattened horn. And a horn, as opposed to being conical, is spherical and has a long throat, and it runs at a higher frequency. And typically horn speakers are 10 times more efficient than conical ones, which means it's very sensitive. But this machine has a very high output for 25 watts. It's a 25 watt stereophonic amplifier. If you're not using these side speakers, this would only be high fidelity. The side speakers and then changing the amp switch to hybrid creates that stereo effect with the wall of sound. Otherwise, you're just getting high fidelity out of this because there's no stereo separation in the cabinet. This machine, as I said earlier, was dead for 51 years, and it has an excellent cabinet. We didn't have to do anything to it, really. We took this off and repainted it. That's the original color. All this was good. Usually you find these kicked in. The motor was slow. We had to service the motor. We sent it to Florida for servicing. And the rest we did here, and it took a lot of work because mechanically they're kind of complex. So this machine is ready to play. It's on free play. It says select, and we can play something. You can watch how it works. It's really interesting mechanism. They use a wheel, it's like a Ferris wheel, and it turns this way. But as it revolves, as it goes through a cycle, going from the first record to the last record in the magazine, you can hear a switch, like a little click. And what it's doing as it's turning, it's basically managing the where that jukebox is going in terms of the selections. Let me show you. Let's play something here.
you smile for the man who held your hand beneath the pale moonlight. But don't forget who's taking you home and in whose arms you're gonna be. So darling, say the last dance for me. Oh I know that the music's fine like sparkling wine.